Before I even tell you what happened, let me just say I never imagined a simple conversation in my own living room could leave me this shaken. It was supposed to be just small talk, the kind you make to be polite. But then my daughter's boyfriend, Lucas, said something I didn't see coming, and it hit me right where I wasn't ready. I can still remember the way the air felt heavy in that moment, and how the rest of the day played out differently because of it. By the way, before we start, tell me from which city are you watching this? I always love knowing where my listeners are from. It was a late Saturday afternoon, the kind where the sun lingers a little too long, spilling golden light across the floorboards. I had just finished cleaning the kitchen, wiping down the counters and putting the kettle on for tea. My daughter Sophia had told me earlier she was bringing Lucas over for a quiet dinner. I'd met him a few times before. Polite, well-mannered, the kind of young man you want to like because your daughter does. The doorbell rang just as I was putting cups on the table. Sophia came in first, her cheeks pink from the wind, and Lucas followed, holding a bottle of wine in one hand and a small bouquet of flowers in the other. "These are for you, Hannah," he said, smiling as he handed them over. I laughed lightly, a little surprised. "Well, aren't you charming?" I replied, taking the flowers and heading toward the kitchen to put them in water. Dinner was easy, the kind where the conversation flowed without effort. We talked about work, the weather, and the little annoyances of daily life. Lucas had a warmth about him, the kind of presence that made you lean in when he spoke, not because of what he was saying, but because of how genuinely he seemed to care about the exchange. After dinner, Sophia excused herself to take a call in the other room. Lucas and I stayed at the table, lingering over the last of the wine. The mood was relaxed, the room softly lit by the lamp in the corner, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the spaces between our words. "So Hannah," he said, resting his forearms on the table, "can I ask you something a little personal?" I keep a small shrug. "Depends how personal." He smiled faintly, but his tone shifted, losing that easy, playful edge. "Sophia, she's strong, confident, but I know that comes from somewhere, from someone, and I can tell that's you." I blinked, caught off guard. "Well, I tried to raise her right." He shook his head gently. "It's more than that. I see the way she carries herself, how she speaks, the way she doesn't back down from what she believes. I think she learned resilience from watching you." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Compliments from younger people often feel polite, almost rehearsed. But this wasn't that. His voice carried a sincerity that went beyond flattery. It was as though he'd been studying me quietly all along, and now finally was letting me know he'd noticed. Something about his gaze lingered, steady and searching. I felt my chest tighten, not from discomfort exactly, but from the way his words peeled back a layer I usually keep hidden. "You don't know me that well," I finally said, my voice softer than I intended. "I know enough," he replied. "Enough to see when someone's lived through more than they let on." My breath caught. I wanted to ask what exactly he thought I'd lived through, but something in his expression told me he wasn't fishing for details. He already understood in a way that didn't need explaining. Sophia came back into the room just then, laughing about something on her phone. The moment shifted instantly, the air between Lucas and me folding back into the easy politeness from earlier, but I couldn't shake it. Later, after they left, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table long after the tea had gone cold. The house was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock. Lucas's words kept replaying in my head, not just what he'd said, but how he'd said it. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't inappropriate, but it was intimate. Not in the way most people think of that word, but in the way that makes you feel truly seen, sometimes more than you're ready for. I realized then how rare it is for someone, especially someone younger, to look past the surface and acknowledge the quiet battles you fought just to stand where you are today. That night, lying in bed, I wondered if Sophia had any idea how deeply her boyfriend had just unsettled me. And I wondered why I couldn't decide whether that feeling was uncomfortable or strangely welcome. I didn't sleep much after that dinner. It wasn't the words themselves that kept me awake so much as the way they landed, like a hand on the shoulder you didn't expect and didn't realize you needed. By morning, the unease had cooled into a quiet alertness, the kind that makes you move a little slower so you can notice things. How the sunlight stretched across the kitchen table. How the steam curled up from my mug. How the house sounded when it was only mine. Sophia texted just after 9. "Good morning, Mom. Dinner was lovely. Lucas said he really enjoyed talking to you." I typed back something breezy, some motherly thank you, and hovered a moment before adding, "He sees you well." She sent a heart and a picture of their breakfast. Blueberries, yogurt, 2 spoons. I stared at it longer than it deserved, thinking how everything about youth seems to come in pairs. By Wednesday, the week had swallowed the edges of that evening, but it hadn't erased them. My day was a carousel of errands, groceries, a post office line that moved like cold honey, a stop at the hardware store for a humming refrigerator drawer. When I got home, the living room felt stale, so I opened the windows to let in the late afternoon breeze and the gentle chatter of the neighborhood. The house softened. That was when my phone rang. "Hannah, it's Lucas." His voice surprised me, not because he was calling, but because he sounded careful, like he practiced saying my name out loud and was testing how it would sit between us. "Hi, Lucas. Everything okay?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, then corrected himself. "Yes, Hannah." A small exhale, a half laugh. I wanted to drop off a book, something we talked about at dinner. The essay on resilience. I found a copy at the shop near campus. It would have been simple to say yes or no, but I paused and realized the pause was me measuring a boundary. I didn't feel threatened by him. I felt seen. There's a difference, and yet the difference can still be complicated. "I'll be home for the next hour," I said. "If it's on your way." "It can be," he said lightly, and we hung up. He arrived with a paperback that looked like it had done a tour of duty in a dozen backpacks. He held it up like a peace offering or maybe a proof of life. "It's a little worn," he said, "but the words are still good." "That's how you know they're worth reading," I replied and stepped back so he could come in. I made coffee and we sat at the table that had witnessed so much of my life. Birthday cakes with uneven frosting, late-night bills. A list written in a shaking hand the day I realized my marriage was not a house but a tent in high wind. Lucas rested his fingers on the book and looked around the room the way a carpenter does, observant, respectful of what's held together over time. "I hope it wasn't out of line what I said last weekend," he began. "I've been thinking about it and I didn't want it to seem like I was prying." "Didn't," I said. "It just traveled farther than I expected." He nodded slowly. "My mother taught high school English. She had a way of hearing the line between what people said and what they meant. Sometimes she'd come home and tell me, 'Words are a door, but you don't have to walk through unless you're invited.' I guess I was standing near a door. 'And you knocked,' I said gently. He smiled and his eyes warmed the way a candle makes a small room feel larger. "I grew up in a house of quiet women," he said. "My grandmother raised Mom alone. They didn't talk much about the hard years, but they carried them. You can tell when someone knows what it's like to carry." I sat back, feeling the old shapes of my story shift slightly. "Carrying makes your hands strong," I said. "But it can make them tired too." A gust of wind disturbed the curtains, and for a moment the room smelled like cut grass and distant charcoal from someone's early barbecue. He looked at me with a seriousness that never tipped into intensity. "I'm not here to make anything complicated," he said. "I'm here because I respect you." And I wanted to say that out loud. Respect. Such a simple word often used like salt, sprinkled, assumed, rarely tasted. Hearing it said with intention made me sit straighter. "Thank you," I said. "And I meant it. That matters more than you probably know." He took a breath as if he'd reached a sentence he'd rehearsed. "There's also something else. Sophia told me pieces of what you've been through. Not the private parts," he rushed to add, "just enough to understand the shape of things. If I said anything that reopened a wound." "You didn't," I interrupted gently. "You marked it. Which is different and kinder." We fell quiet. The refrigerator hummed. A neighbor's dog barked and was told in a weary voice to take it easy. I looked at the book again, the frayed corners, the underline in an ink color no one sells anymore. "Read me something." I heard myself say a paragraph that stuck. He turned the pages without the found near the back. His voice was calm, unpretentious, the words rounded and honest. "Resilience is not a hardening against pain, but a softening around it. A decision to make room for what hurts so that you can move with it instead of being dragged behind." When he finished, he put his palm flat on the paper as if to keep it from closing too quickly. I felt a small tremor in my chest. Not fear but recognition. I spent years hardening. I confessed. Felt safer that way. If you're steel, no one can dent you. But it turns out steel rusts. And softness doesn't. He said it bruises. I countered. Bruises fade. he said and then caught himself. I'm sorry. Listen to me, offering metaphors like I invented them. No, I said, smile surprising both of us. Keep going. You're doing fine. We talked for an hour, time loosening its grip. He told me about his mother's crowded bookshelves and the way she taught him to iron a shirt when he was 11. I told him about the year Sophia refused to speak to me, except through sticky notes. After I sold the house she loved because I couldn't keep it. He listened without trying to fix anything. I realized how rare that is. At one point he asked if he could see the backyard. It was a simple request, the kind you make when you're hoping to stretch a conversation without drawing attention to the stretch. We stepped out onto the small deck where the paint was participating in its slow, inevitable escape. The sky had shifted from bright to silver, the telltale preface of summer rain. He stood at the railing, hands in his pockets, looking at the herb bed that never quite took. My grandmother would have loved this, he said. She grew tomatoes in coffee cans, basil in anything that would hold still. Mine grew petunias, I said. She said. Flowers are proof that a day can improve without asking your permission. He laughed softly, and the sound felt like a warmth you notice only after it leaves. He turned to me then, his expression open, unarmed. I want to be good for Sophia, he said, plain as that. And part of that is knowing where she comes from. Not the geography, the weather. What shaped her? Who taught her to keep going? I'd be honored if you'd help me learn that. There it was, the center of the thing. Not flattery, not flirtation, but a pledge, a request filed under care. Something in me unclenched. A small rain began, the kind that draws darker circles on the deck boards. I nodded. I can do that, I said. As long as you promise to remember she's not a museum exhibit. Living history, he answered, grinning. Understood. We stayed out there until the rain sent us back in. He dried his hair with a dish towel, and for a second he looked so young it acted like a boy who'd been trusted with the family car. He glanced at the clock and I knew the visit had reached its natural end. He thanked me again for the coffee, the talk, the time. Standing at the door, he hesitated, then said, I spoke up on Saturday because I meant it. But if it was too much, it was the right amount, I said. And then because the truth deserved its own clarity, I added. It surprised me. But some doors need a knock. He left, and his absence had the shape of a person. The house held his courtesy like a faint perfume, vanishing and present at once. I washed the cups and put the book on the table with a sticky note for myself. Read chapter 3. When I finally sat down, I realized my hands had stopped doing that small protective curl they sometimes do when I talk about the past. They lay open on the wood, palms resting as if they trusted the surface. That evening Sophia called, bright and breathless. Lucas said he visited. I hope he didn't overstay. He can be earnest when he's nervous. He was kind, I said, and respectful. He brought a book. He would, she laughed. He grew up thinking marginalia was a love language. Then he's bilingual, I said, and she laughed again. That particular laugh she's had since she was 5. Part triumphant, part relieved, as if happiness were an exam she just passed. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into the register we use for things that matter. Mom, can I ask something that might be clumsy? Ask. When I was younger, I know I was hard on you sometimes. You made choices I didn't understand, and I made you pay for it with silence and eye rolls and a lot of superior sighing. I'm sorry. It wasn't the apology I expected that night. Truthfully, I hadn't expected any apology at all, but it landed with the same startling gentleness as Lucas's words. Thank you, I said. You were young. You were hurting. I forgave you at the time. I also forgave me. I want you to like him, she said, almost like a child again. I do, I said. Not because you brought him, because of who he is and because of what he brings out in you. What's that softness that doesn't bruise so easily? I said, and she was quiet, understanding. After we hung up, I walked through the house and turned off lights one by one, leaving only the lamp in the corner. The one that makes the living room look like it knows secrets but won't gossip. I thought about the chapters we inherit and the ones we write. I thought about how dignity feels when someone recognizes it without making you perform it. I thought about doors. Before bed, I opened the book to the page where Lucas had read, and the paper breathed that familiar smell of bold glue and patience. I underlined a sentence, my own pen, joining the chorus of others who had been here before me. Then I did something small but significant. I took the sticky note off the cover and wrote a new one. Invite them for Sunday lunch. Ask about his grandmother's coffee can tomatoes. Tell Sophia about the petunias. Sunday came with its own mood, Sonny. Forgiving a seasoned chicken, sliced peaches, and set out the good plates without turning it into a ceremony. When they arrived, the house felt like it had been waiting in a good way. Sophia handed me a jar of honey from a roadside stand and kissed my cheek with a tenderness that said we were on the same page, if not the same line. Lucas carried in a wooden box. For your herbs, he said, almost shy. Inside were small clay pots and a packet of basil seeds. We can give them a better start, he added. We planted after lunch, the three of us kneeling in soil that crumbled like good cake. Rain had left it soft and forgiving. Lucas pressed the seeds with the carefulness of someone handling a fragile memory. Sophia laughed when a smudge of dirt streaked my cheek and wiped it away with her thumb. Our shadows mingled on the ground, three shapes overlapping. There are moments that don't declare themselves as important and only later reveal their authority. That afternoon was one, not because of fireworks or revelations, but because of the ordinary dignity of three people agreeing silently to take care with one another. When they left, I stood in the yard and let the quiet settle. The basil pots sat in a neat row like promises. I thought of the line he'd read. Make room for what hurts so you can move with it. Maybe the hurt wasn't the point anymore. Maybe the room was back inside. I washed my hands and looked at my reflection in the dark window. An older woman with softened edges and eyes that knew the cost of not giving up. Lucas's words still lived in the air, but they had changed shape. They were no longer a weight. They were a balance. I realized then that what had cut deep wasn't a wound. It was a seam opening just enough to be stitched with something stronger. I turned off the lamp. In the hush that followed, the house felt like a book being closed carefully. Not because the story was over, but because the chapter had earned its close.